We enjoyed having him here. He and I got together probably every 2 weeks and talked about things that were on our mind about restorative justice. Greg spent over 20 years of a life sentence in prison, and he was released. So he is drawing on that experience today and may tell you something about it. Tyrone Werts, I have known for Tyrone, I've probably known you for 25 years, I think. He spent 36 years of a life sentence in prison, and he was commuted by some miracle, because very few people in Pennsylvania get commuted. But it was partly because he's such a special person, and he was such a leader at Graterford Prison. He was the head of the lifers. He was such a role model for so many people. So many other people in prison there have told me how they looked up to him. I remember walking down the corridors with an officer who said, look, if this guy was outside, he'd be CEO of an organization. Well, he is now. Tyrone has started a number of organizations. He was instrumental in the Inside Out prison exchange program that has now become national. It allows prisoners and college students to stay together. He's founder and CEO of the Lifers End Crime Project. He's on the Philadelphia Mayor's Commission on African American Males, and he's a Soros Justice Fellow. And while he was in prison, he got a bachelor's degree. So those are our guests today, and obviously they're highly qualified. And so I'm pleased to welcome the two of you. Greg, I think you're going to start. Is that right? So we'll turn the screen over to you, and then Tyrone is going to chime in. They negotiated. You missed out on the negotiations there. But anyway, Greg, I'll let you take it over.
Thank you. I lost the coin toss. So thank you all for being here. Howard, thank you to you and the Institute for inviting us to be here and to participate in this. This, of course, is a very interesting topic to me because of the bio that you shared and where we come from and what restorative justice can do to transform lives, what I've seen it do in my own life and in other people's lives. So I want to talk just a little bit about, centered on the question of what can the formerly incarcerated individuals play, what role can we play in furthering the cause of RJ? And if I can get my screen, I'm going to share this PowerPoint presentation. So excuse me, it worked just a minute ago and I don't see it here now for some reason. Let me start.
Right down at the bottom next to the Q&A is a share screen button.
I've got the shared screen up. Let's move on. I'll tell you a little bit about what that is. So the role of the formerly incarcerated, can you all see that?
No,
it's not sharing.
It's not sharing for some reason. Okay. Sorry about that. Technology will get us.
Sorry about that. Okay, we'll talk through this. So 3 points that I want to make on the role that we can play possibly as formerly incarcerated individuals. One is that a statement by Mary Parker Follett that says, she talks about conflict, she studied conflict, and she talks about making conflict do something for you, making it work for you. And I liken that into our prison time. And so there are so many people that have so much time inside prison, and a lot of times we don't do anything with that time. So one of the things that I say to anybody when I go back in is make this time work for you. Utilize this time to the best of your ability. You don't know when you might be able to walk out. I had life sentences and did not know that I would ever walk out the door of a prison. But I was preparing myself all the time for that possibility. And so that I was ready to hit the ground running when I got out. And I think being able to utilize the time that we have inside so that we can get something out of that time, whether or not we ever do get out, is an important step. There are many good programs. Tyrone will talk about a few at Graterford that are restorative justice programs inside the prison with lifers groups, people that will never get out, that are doing great work behind bars in restorative justice. So making sure that we utilize the time that we have. Another point that I'd make is we need to rename who we are. We need to change the narrative. Think about a term of someone who has spent time in prison. Can you think of a positive term? We have felons and offenders and convicts. There's not a positive term that refers to who we are and what we've done. And possibly you might say rightfully so, because we're not there for being good people necessarily or doing good things. But I think we need to change the narrative and be able to show the potential that's behind bars by having people who have been inside come back out and become role models, become mentors, if you will, to those that are still in. I think we can begin to change that narrative and begin to change the norm of what we expect from people on the inside and their role in forwarding restorative justice movements, both on the inside and on the outside when they get out. A former organization that I worked for that's now called Cure Violence talks about having credible messengers. And I love that term, saying that someone who has been in that situation, that's been there, has experienced what other people are experiencing on the inside, coming back in and being able to share what they've done with that experience, how they've moved forward from that experience, and giving them, in a sense, someone to follow, a mentor, to become a mentor to them, to be able to show them how to make a contribution in society is important. So those three things, making that time work for you, renaming or reframing who we are, and setting up some positive role models, positive examples, will help us in forwarding what we can do in restorative justice. I want to tell you about two programs that I'm working on currently that we're trying to do those things. One of them is at the U.S. Penitentiary Leavenworth. It's called the Make It Right program. It is about 20, started off with about 17 or 20 people on the inside. These were all people that were going to be released to Eastern District of Kansas sometime in the next 15 months. We started last June of 2017. We had about 12 weeks of classes where we taught conflict transformation, conflict resolution, trauma awareness and resilience, and finished up that time with a transition circle or a reentry circle for each of the individuals. And we've got about 3 or 4 more of those to finish up. We chose that curriculum because conflict speaks to exactly where they are and what they've done necessarily most of the time to get inside. How do we resolve conflict? How do we deal with conflict? What are the choices we have in conflict? How can we make conflict work for us? Those are issues that we deal with every day inside and every day outside, for that matter. So it's a life skill that we can teach. The trauma awareness helps to explain somewhat as to maybe why people make the choices they make. Richard Rohr says pain that is not transformed is transferred. More commonly stated, it might be said, hurt people hurt people. And so when people are hurting, oftentimes the choice they make is to hurt somebody else. And so how do we make better choices in that conflict? How do we make better choices? And how do we bring healing instead of harm? That all speaks in the restorative justice umbrella of being able to repair the harms, to restore the relationships. And so it's all centered on that restorative focus. We've had good success so far. It's a little bit early. We've only been, the first person was released in August. So far, so good, with them being able to get jobs, stay out. The transition circle connected the person on the inside with support people who were going to support them on the outside. So we oftentimes met up with the probation officer that they would be serving with, the halfway house manager or a case manager that they would be working with at the halfway house, family members, friends, anybody that was going to be able to support them in that journey on the way out. And so we would have a reentry circle where we connected all the dots, connected all these people, talked about who was going to be able to help the inmate and how they were going to be able to do that, what the expectations were for the inmate when they returned, what life looked like moving forward for that resident. We did that individually for each of the people on the way out. And again, so far, those have been successful. We have 3 or 4 more yet to do of people being released January and February. So we will be getting to those shortly. One of the other programs that we work with that was actually started before, by the way, the federal program took us 2 years to get going. We worked on it for over 2 years before we got everything in place. So as any of you in corrections know, things don't move very quickly. So it takes a lot of time to be able to set that up. On the Missouri side, we worked with the Missouri Department of Corrections, and I was working with some programming inside there for about the last 4 years. So this program has been a little bit easier to continue, and I'm hopeful that we will get the last portion of that together even this month or next month is what we have it scheduled for. But in that session with the Missouri Department of Corrections, we did a shortened version of the Make It Right program. We called it Core Conflict Resolution Training. Basically talked about conflict resolution, the trauma awareness, and the restorative justice piece, and comparing that with the criminal justice piece. But instead of just teaching the residents there, we were asked to come in and teach the staff some of the same things, because they were having not only resident issues, but they were having staff and resident issues, and then staff issues. So our idea was to go in and teach staff the same thing that we were teaching the residents, and then have a combined class where we would teach staff and residents together to be able to say, okay, now that we both have skills to resolve conflict, how can we make this work for us in the setting that we're at and make it be a win-win for both sides? And so we have done the resident training. We're trying to schedule the staff training right now, and they're trying to see if they're going to approve the staff and resident training. Again, we've been working on that for over a year, and we're almost to the point I'm expecting a phone call anytime to help us to move forward with that. One of the things, there was a study done in 2006 by the Commission on Violent Crime in America. They published a book called Confronting Confinement. And in that book, one of the top 15 findings was that we need to promote a culture of mutual respect within the prison, create a positive culture in jails and prisons. It's grounded in an ethic of respectful behavior and interpersonal communication that benefits everyone. They actually found that this us versus them mentality that so often is exhibited between staff and residents, it makes the prisons less safe and also makes our communities less safe once they get out, because that continues on. And because of the presupposed positions we have and the perceptions we have of who these people are. And so doing things that can break down those walls and break down that us versus them mentality, bringing people together to say, you can still be an officer in the prison, I can still be a resident in the prison, and we can work together to be able to meet mutual goals and make this life better for both of us, are some of the things that we're trying to work on. One last thing that I want to touch on, and then I'll turn it over to Tyrone, make that 2 points. Missouri actually has in their mission, vision, and value statement, under their values, they address restorative justice. And I think that's important in that we go into states and find places that already have a stated agenda for restorative justice, and then push them to make that agenda more real. And I want to read you what Missouri's vision statement says. It says, we value Missouri families and communities that are affected by crime and the role that we play in restoring them. We value the rights of crime victims and the role of restorative justice. We strive to work with offenders to repair harms done and restore the communities to which many will return. So I think by looking at facilities that already have an eye toward restorative justice, we can make greater strides in being able to help further the cause of restorative justice within. And so last thing I want to put into our heads that we have a class called Rethink Conflict that we teach. And I kind of want to leave that thought with you, that we need to rethink how we can work with restorative justice inside. Tyrone's going to tell you, I think, about a program at Graterford and some of the great things they're doing. There's a lifers group that Howard and I talked to and that I went and visited in Nebraska State Penitentiary, by the way, that I'm going to be going back to in April for another session. And so there are groups inside that are trying to further the cause of restorative justice, and we need to be able to do everything we can as credible messengers to be able to help them. And so last point is, one of the areas that I think we can do a better job is by connecting with the victims and those we have harmed. That's a touchy subject, a tightrope to walk in one sense, in that we want to make sure that we don't cause more harm. We want to make sure that we're not re-victimizing those people that we have already harmed. And so a lot of preparation needs to be done in being able to bring both sides to the point where they're ready to come to that table. But I think we can strive to work harder toward reaching that and making that circle come full circle, so that we can restore some of those relationships where applicable. And so I'll stop there and turn it over to Tyrone.
Thanks, Greg. Tyrone, you want to take it from here? You're still muted there. I always forget that too. There we go.
Greg, great job, Greg. Thank you, Howard, and the Institute, patients, and everyone involved for inviting me and Greg to participate in this webinar. As Howard said, I spent 36 years in Graterford Prison, which is about 30 miles outside of Pennsylvania. I went into prison totally ignorant of really understanding the harms to communities and my victim. And it was in the 1990s that I was able to meet Howard, and when he introduced the whole concept of restorative justice to me and the Lifers organization, and we were really, put our minds in a different direction, from one where we only thought about getting out of prison and how to manipulate the environment, to one where we began to really think about our connection to the community and the harm that we committed in the community. And I think one of the things that we did was, I'm sure Howard, you was a part of this, right? When we put together the Victim Offender Immediate Reconciliation Program, which, we had some success with. We worked with the victims organization from the state, right? Howard, Mary Achilles, and in that role, we was able to meet with victim organizations from Philadelphia, Montgomery County, various counties, and sit in circles and really talk about harms to the community. I've been home about 7 years now, and there are at least 2 to 3 restorative justice programs that are going on inside of Graterford at this present time, where guys meet on a regular basis with outside community people to discuss harms and the role they can play in trying to eliminate harms to victims. And our goal for that was in about 2000, we created a program called the Public Safety Initiative. And the whole concept of that program was to really bring men, incarcerated men together to begin to discuss the whole idea and concept of restorative justice and how can we make amends and repair some of the harms that were committed in the community. But we had like a 3 or 4 phase part to that program where we sat in circles. We started off with about 15 men meeting on every Saturday night, having to discuss these honest discussions about crime, violence in the community, harms created in the community, harm the victims. And as each successive Saturday went on, our circle grew to about 250 guys coming down. And the beautiful thing about it was when I decided to hold the discussion, I went to the superintendent and asked him, could we meet without any staff? And I thought that was important because of just the environment that we were in. And I wanted guys to be able to be honest. And so we had this concept they called heighten the contradictions. And so the first, we would throw a question out like, why do we commit crimes? And so guys would go around the circle and they would come with all kind of reasons why crime is committed. And we kind of heighten the contradictions on that. Like, do you love your family? Yes, I love my family. Then why do you carry a gun? If you're going to do something, they're going to take you away from your family. And so that program was very successful, and just in terms of making men aware and aware of the harms that are caused, and awareness of victim and victimization. There's, like I said, there's a restorative justice program going on right now. A guy named Charles and I can't think of the other guy's name, but they run that program. And then there's a guy, Phil, right, Phil. And they work with community people. They bring guys down and take them through the steps of restorative justice practice. And then there's another program where a really brilliant guy named Paul Perry created, because his idea was, as I think Greg mentioned, that hurt people. And a lot of times guys in prison don't see themselves as victims, based on the activity that they participate in. And he put together a program with a curriculum that take guys through a 12-week a step program to really deal with, victimization from all facets. And because, as Greg said, hurt people. We want to make guys aware that when you suffer, when you are a victim of a crime, whether you are a prisoner or citizen, you are a victim and there's a harm caused. And that program has been very, very successful in terms of making guys aware of their own victimization and how other victims feel as a result of the harm that they caused. When I got out in 2011, I was really hyped up about the whole concept of restorative justice, and I wanted to really bring it to the community. So when we talk about the role of formerly incarcerated, the role they can play in restorative justice, I really wanted to, especially in the African American community where restorative justice is not a big topic. I went out and I started the End Crime Project, and part of that project was to connect communities and prisons to meet with people in the community, to talk about restorative justice and talk about the men inside and how do we work together to reduce harms, and talked about conflict resolution and those kind of things. And together with that, we went, not only did we hold community meetings all over Philadelphia, we also went into all the county jails and the halfway houses to bring the message of restorative justice to the guys inside, men and women, as a matter of fact. And we used to have some very, very dynamic conversations. We wanted to bring this message to the community so that people could just be aware of, specifically for guys inside, to be empathetic towards victims. As Greg said, it's a really touchy subject. And I think one of the first principles that we had was to do no harm, especially when you're working with victims. We understand that it's a very delicate subject, and we wanted to approach it carefully. So our principle was to do no harm. But so we're still doing that work. Me and my the crew that I work with, we're still going inside of the county prisons. Not so much up the state prison, because Graterford is already awash with knowledge about of restorative justice. But the county prisons, where guys are a little more transient, that come home a little sooner, we wanted to go in and work with those guys, and in the halfway houses to make them aware. Greg talked about what we should call ourselves in Philadelphia. I don't know whether you do this where you are, Greg, but we call people coming back home from prison returning citizens, right? and to try to take that negative connotation off of men and women coming home. We got some notes here I want to just check out. So that's the work I've been doing with another program that I work with. That it was a woman named Maheen Bina. She had a program called the End Violence Project, and when she came in and met with us, she talked about the one of the ways that we can end violence in our community is to work with the violent, right? And she came in and met with us on a regular basis, and we incorporated restorative justice practices in the circles that we had. And I thought it was a really beautiful concept. As Greg mentioned, it's about credibility. We have credibility on really understanding violence. And what we didn't have was awareness of victimization and the harms that victims feel and the harms that the community feel and our connections to that. And so restorative justice practices is useful in that fashion. And, you know, another thing I want to say is in my role working with the Inside Out program, where we take college students into prisons to meet with, to study alongside with men and women incarcerated, is a lot of it has restorative justice practice in it because it's done in a circle. And although it's an education program, one of the things we like to focus on is talk about, well, to bring about the fact that it's not just an education program, it's about finding some things out about yourself. And so like one of the questions is victimization, why do people commit crime, victimization, and it's very, very powerful for the outside students and for the inside students. And in that context, I have an opportunity to talk to people from all over the world, because Howard says a national program, but right now we are an international program. And so I have an opportunity to talk to people from Scandinavian countries, from Europe. And what I found fascinating about the way they do incarceration is they look at incarceration or those who commit crimes or those who offend as still part of the overall community. And I was kind of stunned by that, because in this country, we don't look at people who are incarcerated that way. And their philosophy is that if someone commits a crime, that somehow society failed them, and they want to really allow them to keep their rights and see themselves as human beings and see themselves as part of the larger community. And I thought that was very restorative, as opposed to how we have this adversarial system in the United States, whereas Greg mentioned is them versus us, which was a good point, because one of the factors that when I talked about the circles that we had on Saturday night, one of the things we really wanted to do was kind of break down the them versus us kind of concept. And because, I mean, we were in prison. A lot of us had transformed our lives, and we had moved into the mainstream way of thinking, yet we were still seen as criminals and with violent behavior, especially with crimes that were committed 30, 40 years ago. We really wanted to break down that them versus us mentality. And so we used to have discussions about really seeing guards, the same way guards seen us as deviant, as less than human. I think a lot of guys in prison looked at correctional officers in the same way. And we kind of felt like using restorative justice practices, if we wanted to be viewed as valuable members of the community, we wanted to be judged as individuals, and we had to do that for the officers also, and begin to see them as people that had jobs, that had families, and just kind of break down that whole cycle. So that's some of the things I've been doing. I've done in Greeted for Prison, and some of the work that I've been doing since I've been out. And I'm going to end it there.
Great. Well, thank you, Tyrone. Greg, do you have any questions or anything you want to add on here? We've got some time. We got some questions coming in, but we can have a little conversation among ourselves too. Anything you want to put in here?
Sure. Let me find my notes here. Returning citizens, one of the things that Tyrone mentioned, we do use that term in some of the reentry circles here, that they use them as returning citizens. That term doesn't do anything for me,
Right.
personally, but it is a neutral term.
Right.
Second thing I wanted to mention was anything that we can do to connect the returning citizens with the community strengthens that tie and reduces the chances for recidivism, the rate at which they would return to prison. So making any kind of those connections is important. One thing many people don't know is voting is one of those possibilities. In 2 states in the United States, they do not take away the right to vote from people that are incarcerated, physically incarcerated in prison. And most people don't know that. 15 states, 13 more states in the District of Columbia allow people to vote as soon as they're not physically incarcerated. And the other 35 plus states have some version of either when they're off probation or off parole or at the end of their completed sentence. Some states, they actually have to petition the governor to get their voting rights back also. So there's various levels, but we should be trying to make those connections easier to retain instead of harder to make. And so some of the things you talked about with restoring and reentering prison, we make it so difficult for somebody to come back out of prison,
Right.
To succeed, because we put up all these barriers on these walls that won't let them succeed in some ways.
Right.
Tyrone, anything else to add here before we go to some questions?
Yeah. I was just talking about, when I talk to people from around the world and they talk about incarceration, the way they do incarceration, and I was thinking that it's going to take a real cultural shift because of the retributive system that we have, the adversarial system that we have, and that to help facilitate guys making that easy transition is we have to change the culture inside of prisons and the way we do incarceration. One of the biggest factors is the dehumanization that goes on inside of prisons, and that we really need to change the culture. And it's a good thing to have programs run by guys inside, doing restorative justice work or conflict resolution work or AVP. But it's a whole nother thing for it to come from the top down, where restorative justice practices are incorporated into the criminal justice system as a whole. And those are some of the things that we really need to push forward as we continue to make people aware of what restorative justice is, what the benefits are to the individual and to the broader community. We need to really push the whole concept of changing the whole culture of incarceration and imprisonment in this country.
Right. Well, the questions are flooding in here, so I'm going to pick up on those, and then I have some of my own if we have time for them, and you may have some more as well. There's a number of questions that have to do with how do you get this thing started, or how do you get buy-in. Or one person says, how do you sell restorative justice to the director of corrections, who thinks that all you need is victim services? Or how do you get prison staff to buy in? Or here's a more extended version of that: how you made your initial entree into state prisons. Well, let's first start with questions about how, when you're inside, how do you get buy-in from staff and from the system, and then we'll look to how you get it once you get out.
It's been very difficult to get buy-in. A lot of times, I really don't know whether the administration is, and as much as you try to make them aware of restorative justice and the benefits to the general population, they see it more as a function of a management tool for them, right? Instead of really looking at the objectives of restorative justice and the value it has for the men returning home. I always tell people that we have this disconnect in the criminal justice system. The court system, the police, the prison system, and the parole system, they all operate independently, right? So it's like whatever happens to an individual once he gets in prison, if he gets paroled to go home, the people, I personally believe that people who run criminal justice prison systems are more concerned about care, custody, and control, and not so much about what happens to an individual when they leave, because they are gatekeepers. So it's one thing to create a program inside of a prison where it's at the lower rung, where the guys inside are running the programs. It's a whole nother thing for the administration at the top of the food chain to really see restorative justice as a viable means for rebuilding lives. Go ahead, Greg.
I would answer two things. On the inside, I think the one thing that I found that helped was credibility. I'd go back to the credibility piece. Being the type of person on the inside, it was the same type of person that I tried to be on the outside. There wasn't any difference. Mm-hmm. And so people saw that. People could verify that, if you will, and put that to the test over a 20-year period. I wasn't faking it for 20 years and just trying to do what I needed to do for a parole board or somebody else. And so being able to do things that were positive, that were uplifting, that were restorative throughout that entire time built that credibility. And I couldn't do what I'm doing now without that credibility to the degree that I'm doing it at this point. So that is a cumulative process. So the programs that I was involved with, the projects that I submitted, a voting project, a mock election project that went through and that got the credence and the okay from the administration. Those were successful programs, and they changed part of the institution. So getting good results was the other thing. Being able to have something on the inside and getting those results. On the outside, as I've gone back into the prisons, the first place I got to go back in was the Missouri Department of Corrections. And having connections got me in the door. And then being able to take them, I got some grant money to be able to fund these programs so I could take them a free program. And they sat in on those programs and saw what the program was. And one of the functional unit managers saw it working in the prison. She came up to me before the other people did, before the residents did one time in class, and she said, you taught this last week. I actually was back in the units, and I saw these guys using the skills that you just taught them, and it worked. Mm-hmm. And she was excited that the guys were actually listening, that they were actually getting something that they could use, and that they were applying it inside. She said, we've got tons of these classes going on inside here, and most of the time the guys just do it for credit, or the people just come in because they can't make that connection. But this actually connected and it worked. And so I think that sold the administration on how valuable the program was, and we haven't had any problem getting in and continuing to do those programs. They actually came to me and suggested that I train their staff. Think about that. When she said that, my jaw hit the floor, probably, because I'm thinking, you want me, the person who's done 20 years in prison, to come in and train your staff on restorative justice and conflict resolution and trauma awareness. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, yes, that's exactly who we want training staff, to be able to get a different perspective, to be able to share both sides, if you will, or different sides than what they normally get. And because that's going to work. The whole push for restorative justice programs is coming together, is the collaborative effort. And that is such a foreign concept within the prisons. It's us versus them. So it breaks down that, and it's a new enough concept that they can say, we've never thought of this before in some ways. It's always us versus them. We can't trust them. They can't trust us. What does a restorative prison look like? Can this work to where instead of a CO writing somebody up for breaking a rule inside, how do we say, let's look at the harm that was done to the group of guys that are in this pod, this residential unit, and say, how did it harm the officer? How did it harm the other people involved? How did it harm the person who committed this rule violation, which is all they see it as? And instead of writing them up and giving them a punishment, a whole shot or a ticket or whatever, extra duty time, let's see what the harm was done and how can we repair that harm and mend that so that we can still live in this community that we have to live in for the next X number of years.
Awesome.
You want to add anything, Tyrone?
No, I think, Greg, well, without a doubt, I mean, you got to do the work and let people see how it works and how it functions. And even inside Gradeford, there are a lot of counselors and unit managers who are very receptive to restorative practices, because I mean, they can see the results of it. But when we talk about when you move up the food chain to the secretaries of the Department of Corrections and the deputies, that's a whole nother animal, because they're not on the ground. They don't really see, and they're in the business of daily management of the prison system. One of the ways you can get buy-in, I think Greg mentioned it, the more staff people or the more DOC people you get involved in discussions, especially, sitting in circles with guys inside, to that, as Greg said, begin to break down that them versus us mentality, and they begin to see the value of it. And when you start talking, when guys decide, begin to use words like victimization on harms and repairing harms and making amends, I think that's valuable for people in the Department of Corrections to see and witness.
Use your allies that you have in there, because like any program, everybody is not going to go along with it. So find the 20% or the 5% that are really behind that, and find the people that they can influence and use them on the inside to do their magic also.
Right.
One person is asking something I was thinking about, and that is, how do you get credibility among the men and women who are serving time inside? And I remember, that brings back a memory, Tyrone, when Julie Hall and I first offered that Restorative Justice course, you got the leadership of the lifers filled that course. Remember, you were in there and others.
Right.
And I learned later you were checking us out.
Right.
And when you all said this was credible inside, it gave a credibility that we just would not have had otherwise.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that is absolutely right, because there's a hierarchy in prison and among prisoners, and people that have credibility can speak value to various programs, and so credibility is a big thing. When you say, like, this is something that is useful and that is valuable, guys tend to listen to that when you have that credibility.
Some of the programming that's done in some of the places where I've been, most of the programming is geared toward people who have less than 5 years to the board or 5 years to the streets, because they think those are the people that they need to prepare most of the time. And so all of this programming is geared toward people who have 1 to 5 years or less. My whole battle cry to the administration was, if you want to change the culture of the prison, you need to go to the people who are living in this prison, the ones that are doing life, the ones that have done the 20 years, because those are the ones, if you get them on your side, the other people that come in for 1, 2, or 5 years, they look up to the people who have the established credibility, like Tyrone was just saying, the people who were scouting out your program to see if it worked at the beginning. And if you change the culture, you need to change the culture of the people who live there and abide there and have been there for that length of time. Because if you get them on board, the other people will follow. So targeting a different audience, if you will, going with the people who have the most invested in that prison community. And those are the people that live there continually and may live there for the rest of their lives.
A couple of the questions have to do with the idea of bringing people, so-called victims and so-called offenders, together. Most of the programs you're talking about are not doing that, because the programs that are doing that are largely, for various political reasons and others, run by things like victim services, right? Mm-hmm. So most of the programs you're talking about have to do with awareness raising, responsibility, opportunities, things like that, but not actual dialogue. Is that right? Although they exist. I mean, like in Gradeford and others, those programs exist, but they are run by the victim, by Office of Victim Advocate.
Well, let me just say this real quick, Howard, that, you know, in Pennsylvania, there's a law that prevents people who are incarcerated, prevent them from contacting their victim. So you got to go through victim services, and that's a very, very long process, very difficult process to navigate. But they do have that program, and I don't really know. I know a couple of people that had that experience, although there are many, many more who would like to have a mediation between them and their victims. One of the problems with is, especially with people who serve a long time, 20, 25, 30 years, it's very hard to identify victims. But the beautiful thing about the program that we ran and greeted for it with you, Howard, was that at the very least, if a guy never had the mediation process, we would have them write letters to their victim, whether it was sent to the victim or not. We thought it was cathartic for them to be able to have that opportunity to really sit down and write a letter to the victim, although the victim may never have seen the letter.
And some states now have that depository online, don't they, where you can write letters that victims can access, so the person in harm can access. But Greg, you were going to say something?
Yes, I think most of the states have some form of Office of Victim Services now, through which those people who have caused the harm need to reach out through them in order to reach the people they have harmed. That happens sometimes, it doesn't happen other times. There's a wider community of the programs that we're dealing with in Missouri and Kansas. We're looking at harms also to family members who have been harmed by the incarceration, or friends who have been harmed. Mm-hmm. And so maybe not the main person who has been harmed, but the residual, the ripple effect. And so we are addressing that harm and the victim offender roles, if you will, on that plane, at least as a starting point, to be able to build to a point where maybe they could get to the point where they would talk to the actual victim in their case, or victims.
And now that is awesome.
Yeah, that is. Well, we got a lot of questions coming in here. So let's keep going here. One person is asking about returning relatives. I'm not quite sure what he means, but what about returning relatives, seeing everyone as being a part of our family? Do you get a sense of what he's asking there?
Returning relative. You mean how to incorporate a returning family member?
That's what I'm wondering. They might have things like those transition circles, and that maybe he's referring to that.
If that's what he's speaking of, I can speak to the transition circles or reentry circles. A good book by Lauren Walker out of Hawaii that does transition circles or reentry circles there that you can get a hold of. But the relative piece, seeing everybody as part of that family and knowing what the expectations are from the family members, because sometimes they have been harmed in many ways. Children have been harmed by not having parents there, spouses. A lot of times there's not a space to be able to talk about that, either in prison or on the phone or that sort of thing. And even if you've talked about it, putting it into reality and living that, instead of just, okay, we've got this plan moving forward or how we're going to move forward, but living that is something totally different, especially after having been separated for a long time. So taking a look at ways to be able to mend all of those family ties, if you will, whether it's relatives or family members, is what we try to look at in this reentry or transition circle.
Yeah, and that's good, because one of the things that we tried to do with PSI was incorporate that aspect of it, harm that was caused by family, because a lot of times people don't think about, they'll think about the actual victim, the victim of the crime, and really don't think about the victimization that family members and loved ones go through. And so part of our circles that we used to talk about was actually the harm that was caused to the family, because, I mean, we knew that we would never have opportunity to really actually talk to our immediate victim. And so we used to talk about the impact of crime, violence, and harm on not just the victim, but also on the broader community, on the broader neighborhoods, and on the family and children. Right now, there's another program that's running right now that is very, very powerful. It's called FACT. It's Fathers and Children Together. And in that program, they do is they bring the children up to meet their fathers, sit in circles and have discussions and talk about, the separation, the harm caused to the child as a result of the father being incarcerated. So, I mean, a lot of times people don't understand what they're doing, but a lot of that has is born out of the whole discussion around restorative justice, because I think, what's interesting is after I came home about 3 years later, I received a letter from a guy that was incarcerated. He said, Tyrone, you don't know how much you missed inside the prison, because, I remember all the discussions you used to have with us about various things about the community, about violence, about harms. And he said, but what was created as a result of that, there are a lot of little Tyrone Werts running around the institution creating programs. And a lot of those programs was born out of the discussion that we used to have around restorative justice. And I think the FAT program, the ICANN program, what Charles and them are doing, what Paul Perry is doing with victimization of incarcerated people, were all born out of discussions that we started in the 90s on restorative justice.
There's a question that I know that's close to both your hearts, and I know, Greg, you've talked about this, and that is how do we work across states, or how do we, Greg, I know you've dreamed of an association of formerly incarcerated. Any thoughts around that?
Yeah, so my day job is with the Center for Conflict Resolution in Kansas City, which is a nonprofit organization. And I get to do some of the prison programming. We also do programming in schools and in the community, teaching restorative justice, conflict resolution, mediation, a lot of different things. I'm also president of the board of an organization called Reaching Out From Within that's in every prison in Kansas and also in some of the prisons in North Carolina, 3 different prisons there. And it's was started by a lifer in the Kansas prison system. It's got a curriculum of a 400-page curriculum book that talks about a lot of different topics. RJ is not one of them yet, but it deals with being able to connect the dots, so to speak, within Kansas. And my goal or vision is to try to bring together all of these different state programs that have people, 650,000 people leave prison every year, right? And so how do we connect those 650,000 people into a national database? I hate to use this example, but it's the best one I have, an AARP, so to speak, of formerly incarcerated individuals, where they can have resources available to them. They can have local resources and national resources. They can have a connection. They can have programs that are there. They can learn from those things. And so one of my visions, hopefully in the future, is to find a way to be able to connect these people through a database, through by connecting the dots of all these different programs that are across the state. And I'm working on trying to get some funding for starting a database where people can just register when they get out of prison, so that we can start building that database and start connecting to local programs and programs that are already in service there.
Nice.
Well, I have a connection for you. The person asking this question is Baba Eng from Buffalo, New York. Prisoners Are People too is our organization. I did 36 years straight in New York State prisons. I've been out since 2013 doing restorative justice work in Buffalo, building a restorative community. So there's a connection. Great.
Love to talk to you more. And I think one of the questions also asked if they could get our contact information, and Howard, we can put that out. Mine and you all can contact us to be able to further the conversation.
Great.
The one person is asking whether you know of any restorative justice work involving the U.S. military prisons at Fort Leavenworth. Is restorative justice possible, appropriate for that prison environment? Any thoughts on that?
I have a friend who does some meditation work inside the military prison, but we have not ventured in there yet in order to go for restorative justice. We partnered with the Federal Public Defender's Office to get connections into USP Leavenworth, and they also have some connections at the military prison. So that's a possibility that we might take a foray into the military prison, but I don't know of anything going on currently at this time at that location.
Neither do I. In federal prisons.
There are questions here about how people in the community can get connected with this kind of work. The one particular question comes from here in Virginia, and our prisons are much less accessible. I mean, having lived in Pennsylvania and continue to work there, there's so many volunteer things going on, and I've just found Pennsylvania so much more accessible for outside people. But do you have any thoughts on that generally? How can people in the community get involved with this kind of work?
You mean do with this kind of work out in the community or connecting prisons?
Connecting with either formerly incarcerated or people who are incarcerated.
Well, one of the ways they can do that is, I think what Greg talked about, creating that database, and so that people can go right to a website or whatever and get connected up. But I think, you know, one of the things I did in Philadelphia was I held community meetings. Philadelphia is a city of neighborhoods, so there's West Philly, South Philly, North Philly, Germantown, and we would hold community meetings with just with community people. We announce it on the radio. We do public service announcements. We would put flyers in car windows and in homes and shopping places to come to a particular location so that we can, you know, sit in a circle and really discuss this kind of work. And one of the things we did was really pass out literature about organizations that they could get in contact with that was actually doing this work. One of the things we really wanted to do, because you know, our whole concept was connecting prisons and communities, because people are coming back to the community and there was this disconnect. And so when we talked about connecting communities and prisons, we was talking about taking the community inside of the prison, and so that guys can hear directly from community people about the criminal justice process, about victimizations, about harm, about violence in the community. So that is just one way they can get involved in this. Go ahead, Greg.
Another way, I know every prison has some type of volunteer coordinator, volunteer program within that prison. So you can reach out to the local prison, wherever you're at the state level or local level, and try to connect. For reaching out from within the organization that I'm president of, we get calls from the volunteer coordinator at a facility that says, hey, I just got a call from somebody who wants to volunteer, and I put them in touch with you and your organization. And they'll disperse that to different organizations depending upon what they want to do in prison. So that's one way. Being able to find out, you know, these resources, know the resources that are available. I've been in prisons in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, in Virginia, in Nebraska, in Missouri, Kansas, California, different places, and every rule is different. Every what is required to get into the prison and to maintain that entrance is different. There's some similarity, but so often it's jumped through whatever hoops that state has. And so just finding out what those are and being able to qualifications are. And so being able to do that and being able to connect with somebody there inside, I'd love to start building this database. So if people have groups and organizations that they want to start connecting, let's start doing that.
And you're going to put your contact information on our website with the video or something like that so they can get you in touch?
Sure. I can put the PowerPoint that didn't show.
We're having a little trouble with your connection, but I'm getting the gist of it here. Yeah, this webinar will be online in a few days, and we'll maybe be able to put some other resources around with that. And by the way, I meant to mention earlier, we did have a webinar with Lauren Walker about these reentry circles a while back, and that is on our website. So you're able to, those of you who are interested are able to watch that. Somebody, Jeff Fromm, who's a graduate of ours and works in prison with trauma stuff and restorative justice, is asking what your trauma awareness work looks like. What are the areas you cover? Are you doing adverse childhood experiences, STAR model, brain stuff? What kind of stuff are you doing that has with trauma?
Hey, Jeff. All of the above. We don't do as much on the adverse childhood experience, but we do take a lot of the material. We are STAR trained. That's the strategies for trauma awareness and resilience put out by Eastern Mennonite University, and trauma in the brain. So we try to connect as many dots as we can with the people inside to say, because you're hurt, you've one else. Connecting the dots saying, it's not an excuse as to why you harm somebody, but it is a cause and a symptom in so many ways. And so it's okay to say you've been victimized, you're a victim and possibly the person who's caused the harm. So you've been harmed and you've also caused harm. And being able to blur those lines, to recognize that it's not a binary, it's not one or the other. So often those people who have been harmed are the ones that end up causing harm, and that just keeps passing down. And so being able to see both, I refer to it as both sides, multiple sides, so that those lines are blurred, so it's not one or the other, that binary, but yet it is a blending. Yes, I've been hurt, and I've also caused hurt, and now I'm trying to heal that harm that I've caused.
Yeah, that's right on time. I don't do trauma-informed work, but that's one of the things that Paul Perry does with his program. Get guys to talk about their own victimization, their own hurt, so that which helps them better understand the hurt that victims experience. So, yeah, I don't do that work, but there's some of that work going on inside of Greater Prison.
Another person asked whether you're using mindfulness as part of with the restorative justice work at all.
What? We are looking into some of that. We've done some NVC, some nonviolent communication connections, and some mindfulness. We haven't tied it directly with the RG pieces that I've been doing in prisons, but we're looking at some of that, and I think that's another avenue, another benefit that could come from bringing that into the prison programs.
Yes.
Here's a question that I'm interested in these binaries between the labels of victim and offender, which is a topic that's come up in other webinars we've had here. When I sit in a room as a graduate student, people are intent on listening to my experiences of being harmed. As an ex-offender, they are more interested in my experience as harm doer.
Right.
These experiences are deeply intertwined. Aside from running to a priest and a therapist, what do you folks recommend to deal with restoration as a holistic process? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I think the circle process is one great way to be able to address that. Being able to sit in circle, talk with other people who have experienced that same thing, or not in some cases, but being able to address some of those points. I'm not so sure, like in therapy, I wouldn't call what we do therapy or counseling necessarily, but coaching possibly. But being able to talk about those experiences. We don't deal with conflict. We don't deal with harms. We don't often deal with that. And so we don't know how to deal with those things. And so by talking about that, we can find ways to express that, acceptable ways to express that, acceptable ways to acknowledge the harm that was done to us, and are lashing out to other people and ways to repair that.
Somebody's asking here a more general question. What are the national organizations that are working toward ending mass incarceration? There are a number of them. I don't know if you can pull those off the top of your head or not. Anything you can name offhand?
There's Justice USA. There are a number of organs. I mean, it's I mean, right here in Philadelphia, we got CAD-B, we have Decarcerate PA. I think the NAACP is doing some work around that. Right now, I can't even think of all the organizations but you know, there is a lot of movement into in the mass incarceration. But I can't really. Greg probably know a little more organizations. I work a lot locally. I don't go stretch outside of PA.
I know Just Leadership is one organization out of New York that is behind the Close the Rikers campaign, and is also behind a cut the population, incarceration population in half by 2030, I believe it is.
2025.
Okay. So I know that's an organization that's doing that. That was led by Glenn Martin until just December. But there are several different organizations like that that are out there. Again, there's not a national movement necessarily. They're more local movements that are there. And one of the things I see is that we need to connect the dots. We need to be able to have this national organization that would be able to connect reaching out from within that's in Kansas to a Just Leadership in New York, to a program in Minnesota, to a program in Philadelphia. Not necessarily to duplicate those or reinvent the wheel, but to say, hey, we're here. Here's what we're doing. Let them know what you're doing and find a way to work together on a national stage too.
Right.
Well, just today, I got an announcement for a second conference at UCLA is holding October 12 through 14, called From Criminalization to Liberation, bringing together people who are impacted by incarceration. So there's that was something I didn't know about previously. So there's a lot going on these days. But you're right. We need to find a way to connect these dots and so people can find them.
Right.
Somebody's asking, are there restorative justice programs in Spanish and other languages in prison with halfway houses and other kinds of things? What are the Spanish-speaking opportunities?
I know what we've done because we have such a large Spanish-speaking population, and we work closely with an organization called LASEO, the Latin American Cultural Exchange Organization. And every time we put together materials, we would have that organization transcribe them or translate them into Spanish. So that, and actually inside Graterford, a lot of times, beginning around 2000 or prior to 2000, there was a lot of separation amongst the organizations inside of Graterford. Everybody was into their own niche and did their own thing. But around 2000, the organizations began to work together. And one of the organizations, like I said, is the NAACP, the JCs, the veterans. And so we began to work together. And one of the things that was that came out of that was that, and the Spanish community shared this with us, that when we have meetings and all the documentation in terms of, because we had a huge database of family members and community members where we should do bulk mailing to every month, and they used to help us transcribe all our materials to Spanish.
The little book of Restorative Justice is available in Spanish. I don't think it's advertised very well. I noticed in the numbers that just came this week that it's not a huge number selling, but out in the country, I mean, it's being sold in South and Central America. Judy Clark here in Virginia says the Virginia Supreme Court just translated the book that their restorative justice program called How to Handle Conflict into Spanish. It's a book for youth. So there are a variety of things, but it's pretty scattered, I think, so far. There's a thank you from one person who says, my congratulations on the seminar. Thank you so much for giving me some direction on how to get started. I'm a member of Shalom Mennonite in Tucson and worked 14 years in prison. This gives me hope. So
wow, great.
That's good to know. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yes.
A person asking about Florida specifically, how to make an initial entree into state prisons, and particularly concerned about the number of people going on death row into life without parole, and what can be done there. I don't know if there's anything you can say beyond what you've said about that or not.
Well, look, I mean, with anything that has to do with prison, I think the community got to be aware of, really be aware of the criminal justice system, because it impacts so many areas of all of our lives, of people in this country. And so I just think, as we talked about earlier about a database, is contacting organizations that are already doing work in that area in the criminal justice system. People down in Florida can reach out to them to see, just become aware of all the issues that's surrounding incarceration and criminal justice in that particular state. The whole idea of people, death sentences getting transferred to life without parole, that's something that we've been struggling with here in Pennsylvania for over 40 years, because in Pennsylvania, life means life. You don't get out. As Howard said, I was blessed to be able to get my sentence commuted after 36 years, but I left behind thousands of men and women who are serving life without parole, who deserve to have the opportunity, who have really transformed their lives, who have credibility and have integrity. But because we're in a country of this adversarial situation, them versus us, it's all about the rule of law, no matter what the circumstances of your particular crime is, role, culpability. Once you get labeled, that's what the situation is.
I want to just echo that. The fact that there are thousands of people that I even know that are in prison that could come out and be sitting here on this seminar and do a better job than I am probably at being able to talk about some of this. They exist in there, and that's the myth that people don't see of people behind bars. And so recognizing that, but because we're a country of incarceration, we incarcerate more people than anybody else. 5% of the world's population and almost 25% of the world's prison population. So because of those norms that we have, we don't see people behind bars as being capable, as being eligible to be able to do some of the things. And so changing that narrative and changing that norm is how we make those changes come into being.
Right, and this is why restorative justice practices are so important to change. I think that when we begin to change the culture of incarceration and prisons, and incorporate more practices that include restorative justice, I think that is one way that we can begin to really decrease our prison population, because we begin to see people differently. As long as we in this adversarial kind of mindset where it's them versus us, that kind of really breaks down the whole system. So I think we got to really do more to really make people aware of what restorative justice is, because it's really about making the community whole and healing and bringing people together. Long as we have this them versus us mentality, this adversarial system, I don't see progress being made.
There's Baba Ing in Buffalo says they're holding a regional conference that some people may be interested in, called the Alliance. The organization is called the Alliance for Families of Justice, in April. He's also wondering if 3 of us can come and speak, but that's a whole nother. I know Tyrone and I are trying to act retired.
Call me.
Greg is a world traveler. He'll go anywhere.
Here's a tough one. I'm really touched by the great job you're doing. It appears to be a complex field, and we need more involvement in action in the field of restorative justice. How can we apply restorative justice to people being sentenced by the International Criminal Court? Because having killed millions of people, how can we bring this kind of people to a table with these broken families? That's a huge topic. We maybe ought to try a whole webinar on that. In fact, maybe put that
some really high-level experts on that kind of topic.
Yeah, anything you want to add to that, though? Or should we just pass that off? Whoever.
Greg?
I would just say harm is harm, right? And people that cause harm are have similar qualities, and being able to see people as human, being able to see at the core that we don't have throwaway people in our society, that that people are redeemable, that they deserve a second chance if they prove that they are willing to try to make that second chance meaningful. I think that's at the core of those types of questions, and some people aren't there yet.
Right.
Restorative justice, one of the frameworks that Howard made in restorative justice in many ways is that it is accommodating to the people involved in that harm. And so it may take 5 years, it may take 25 years, it may take a lifetime for people to get to that point where they can come together, if they ever do at all. And so it can be tailored to whoever's involved. And sometimes we get there. Sometimes it's a work in progress over a long period of time, and we may not get there, not in this lifetime. But that's the beauty of it. So striving for the fact that there's no throwaway people in our society, and people are redeemable, and that we can try to touch them. Nobody came out of the womb intending to cause harm. And so it's a learned trait. And so I think we can unlearn that the right way.
A question coming from Minnesota: how can we learn more details about these programs? And that is a tricky question, isn't it? Because like one of the Graterford programs is so powerful. The guys there invented the program, but it is not easily available to others. But is there anything you can tell us about where to get more information on the kind of programs you've talked about?
Well, one thing, I can put them in contact with the people, the guys that run that program in Graterford. It really is about information sharing. One of the things that we really wanted to do when we were in Graterford was when we put our information together, we really wanted to, replicate it in all the prisons in the state of Pennsylvania and across the nation. Because you know that Graterford was a unique prison in the Pennsylvania system. As Howard said earlier, that we have a volunteer role of over close to 500 people coming in running all types of programs. And so one of the things is when we put programs like this together, the men inside have no problem with sharing that information, because they're all about the people and rebuilding lives. And no matter where those lives are rebuilt at. So there's a possibility that I can put them in touch with the guys inside who can share the information, so that no matter where that person is, I can't remember where you say they were from, but they can go in and meet with the guys inside and start a program inside.
Okay, well, we're just about out of time. We need to turn it over shortly to Michaela. I have my own questions I would ask, but I think we're out of time for that. Tyrone, I was just thinking, you were so instrumental in my book, Doing Life. You know, when I was doing that, you were such a part of it. And as you know, I recently got permission to go back and re-photograph and interview some of the same people. If anybody viewing is interested in seeing at least those photographs, they're on my website, which is just howardzehr.com. I hope at some point it'll be another book or an exhibit, but it was such an honor to go back and talk to some of the people I had stayed in touch with, but a lot of them I had not been able to. And so that was really a very special time.
You know, it's really bittersweet about that whole book, because it's bittersweet in this way, that as I look back over the 25 years that book was done, a lot of the guys that you photograph who are juvenile lifers, and you know, a lot of those guys have come home. And the bitter part is, on the other hand, a lot of people have died since the advent of that book. And so to go in and you know, Frank Lee is home, Michael Twiggs is home, Freddie Knowles is coming home. So it was a really, really powerful book. I got my book right here. I got a lot of yellow tabs to it, because I was going through it and checking off to see who died and who got out. You know,
some committed suicide. Yeah, it is a bittersweet.
Yeah. Oh, suicide too. I forgot about.
The book was called Doing Life, since we're doing a commercial here. Okay, thanks, guys. This has been great. It's so good to have a chance to talk with you. I'm going to turn it over to Michaela now to and then I'll come back for a few final words here. But
Thank you.
Kayla, you could take it here.
Thank you, Howard.
Thank you.
Thank you for presenting today, and thank you for everyone for attending our webinar. My name is Michaela Waters Crittenton, and I'm a graduate student at the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding. I'm the graduate assistant for the Zehr Institute, and I have a couple of announcements for you all. Please bear with me, my computer is not cooperating.
Technology.
Slides. All right.
We seem to be having trouble today.
I know. So our Spring 2018 webinar series will take place on Wednesdays from 4:30 to 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. These are our upcoming webinars on the screen, and we hope that you can join us for all of them. Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience, otherwise known as STAR, is a research-based training program. It combines theory and practice from multiple fields, and it's designated for individuals and organizations whose work brings them into contact with populations dealing with current and historic trauma. If you're interested in learning more, please visit the link below and note the dates for our upcoming trainings. Our graduate certificate in restorative justice can be completed in 18 credit hours. You can do it by taking courses through our Summer Peacebuilding Institute or through a combination of one semester on campus and one summer term. Please visit the website for information and registration. If you're interested in the intersection of restorative justice and education, we offer a master's in education with an restorative justice and education concentration or 15-hour graduate certificate in restorative justice and education. It can be used by a variety of professionals working in educational settings. We also offer a master's degree in conflict transformation. Along with that, this fall marked the beginning of our first offering of a master's degree in restorative justice through CJP. The curriculum is practice-based and ideal for individuals looking for looking to be reflective practitioners in their chosen field. Last but certainly not least, the Zehr Institute website is available as a source for upcoming events and is a repository for past webinars that are linked to YouTube. The recordings for tonight's webinar will be available within 48 hours. That concludes my announcements, and I will turn it back over to Howard Zehr for a few closing comments.
Thank you, Michaela. So yeah, join us again. Next month will be another webinar. This one having to do with that I'll be hosting, having to do with the question of restorative justice standards. Do we need standards? What are the dangers in having standards? What would standards look like? So that's I will be hosting that one. Greg and Tyrone, thanks again. It's so great to see you, and this has been a great webinar and a great resource. So be well, and let's stay in touch. Thanks everyone for joining.
Hey, Greg, great job. That's why you should have went first, because you're a great guy. You do this stuff, and you do it every day. You're powerful. I really loved it.
Thank you to both. Thank you, Howard. Great job.
See you all. Good night, all.
Good night.